Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Ricky Jones, the chair of the Pan-African Studies Department at the University of Louisville. Again, I am your campus faculty coordinator for your Introduction to Pan-African Studies course at your high school. Hopefully, you've read and gotten through chapters 1 and 2 of your text so far, and now we're getting into some real core stuff that is with history. So, it's very, very important that history serve as the foundation for all of our studies, as Brother Malcolm X said. But if you don't have a good historical understanding of what's going on around any subject matter, then things kind of fall through the cracks. So let's go to your text immediately in your reading. These are some of the things that I think really should be highlighted, and your teachers at your school will carry you through them. But first of all, let's go to the notes directly from the text. Your author says that history is really defined by four major struggles. That is, humanity struggles against nature, society, other human beings, and their immediate selves. 1, humanity struggles against nature. 2, society. 3, other humans. 4, their immediate selves. That is, what history really is the story that talks about our development as human beings, how we encounter the world, how we encounter each other, and how we develop ourselves because of those encounters. It is incredibly important that we place all of those things into context. And certainly for the purposes here, how did race come into being? How did we start to distinguish these different colors, ethnic groups, as we moved along? And how did some groups start to see themselves as superior to others that led to some very nasty, nasty consequences that we'll look at? Let's go to the notes again as we move to a very important point. This course is not simply about American history, as you'll see in your reading. The first thing that your author and others who talk about this material try to establish is that Black people are not simply dropped onto the world stage in America in 1619 as slaves. That's not the complete story. What we really see is that Black folk existed long before even the founding of what we now call America. The first human being walked the earth in Africa, Australopithecus africanus. That is not a racial argument. That is simply a historical fact that most folk, most anthropologists and historians agree upon. So what was going on before Greece and Rome, before America, before American slavery on the continent of Africa, where Black people existed and then moved throughout the world to establish different racial and ethnic groups? That's very important for us to look at. This is important too. It seems nonsensical, but it's really not, is the understanding that Africa is not a country. Africa is not a country. We have to begin our studies on the continent of Africa. But the first thing we must understand is we're talking about a continent. We're talking about a very large landmass that the United States can fit into more than 4 times. Okay, that is a large physical space. And so Karenga talks about a number of things that serve as problems when we talk about studying African history. 1, the vastness of the subject. Vast continent, and it is a continent in flux. So the vastness of the subject. We're talking about a huge physical body with a whole lot of different types of people over a long period of time. So it is a vast subject. It's sometimes hard to get our arms around it. 2, the predominance of oral history that we found on the continent. That is, a lot of stuff wasn't written down. Some was, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, especially when we get into Egypt, even flowing into the religion chapter. Some things were written, other things were not. A problem with oral history, though, is as things are passed down, sometimes they get distorted. In some cases, we even had the presence of some people in certain culture that we now call griots, G-R-I-O-T-S, griots. These are the people who held the culture, the history of a society themselves. But they would pass it on to another chosen griot from the next generation. Ask yourself this though. What would happen if a griot would die before he or she could pass this information on? That's a problem with oral history. 3, we have a problem now with the Europeanization of history, and we've talked about this already. It is very dangerous if the history of the world is told from one perspective. It doesn't matter if that perspective is the perspective of Africa, or that perspective is the perspective of Europe, or the perspective of America. If we simply have one perspective, we can miss a lot globally. So with the Europeanization of history, the Europeanization of education that we've all certainly experienced in American education, we only get one little corner of the story, right? And quite often, Africa is lost in that shuffle. Ask yourself, how much about Africa do you really know? And if you don't know very much about Africa, how much about African descended people do you know? Let's shrink it a little bit, and we'll get to this as we get to our own country. How much about African American history do you really know? That's a scary proposition, not just for people who are taking classes right now, but in many cases for people who are teaching them. Our intellectual infrastructure where Black people is concerned is very, very problematic. We don't have courses, curricula, or teachers quite often who are skilled enough to teach the subject matter that we're embarking upon. But we're trying to fix that, and we're trying to start with you in this course. So 3 problems of study: vastness of the subject, the predominance of oral history, and the Europeanization of history. As you go through your text, I emphasize to my students that I don't really care about them knowing all the details about what was going on in certain societies, but you should come out of here knowing that there were generally three Nile Valley civilizations: Nubia, Egypt, and Ethiopia. You should know the ancient names, right? The ancient Egyptians did not call Egypt Egypt. They called it Kemet, Kemet, though this is contested. So again, we get to the Europeanization of history. When you tear the word Kemet apart, the etymology of Kemet, that's a great higher education word, etymology. That is the study of words, right? That is a big one. The etymology of Kemet, when you break it down, translates, according to some, meaning the land of the blacks, the land of the blacks. Others have contested that when they talk about the word Kemet, even though they acknowledge that the ancient Egyptians called their country Kemet. They make the argument that Kemet didn't mean land of blacks, but meant land of black soil. Land of black soil. There is a racial element to this. People understand that Egypt was an advanced and incredibly dynamic civilization in the ancient world. So for folk who make the argument that somehow race is an issue that predetermines intellect, that predetermines any type of ingenuity, it is in conflict with the idea that this could have been done by black people. Please understand, geographically, Egypt is in Africa. Northern Africa, yes, but still Africa. And you look before the 14th dynasty or so, the phenotype, right? The appearance of Egyptians was very different. That's changed over the centuries because of race mixing. So could black people really have built pyramids? Could black people have really built all of these monuments and statues, a great civilization that was so advanced? Could black people have done this? If that holds historically, then we have a problem. So again, I cannot overemphasize this. Africa is a continent. Egypt is in Africa. Many people say, well, I thought Egypt was in the Middle East. Look, there is no such place necessarily land-wise as the Middle East. Middle East is a political construct. Again, if there is a Middle East, then where's the Middle North or the Middle South or the Middle West? So go look at your maps. You'll still find that Egypt is in Africa. It is one of the ancient Nile Valley civilizations. But we also have Nubia, which is broken down into 4 periods in your text: pre-Karma, Karma, the Napatan and Meroitic phases, and finally Ethiopia, the biblical Kush. Let's keep going with our notes with important pieces to remember, and your teachers will carry you through these in greater detail. We've looked at the Nile Valley civilizations. Then I want you to remember the Western Sudanic civilizations, that is Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Great story coming out of Mali. I think the original big baller came out of Mali in the person of King Mansa Musa, who goes on his Hajj in 1324 and spreads so much gold around the region, that is, throws so much money around the region that he completely disrupts the economy. So Mansa Musa is a great guy to remember from the Western Sudanic period of Africa. And then your text moves on to the Moorish Empire. The Moors were black again, and they move into Spain. And we talk about architecture, social transformation, cultural innovation that happens in Spain. A lot of this is because of the Moors. And we even see Moorish motifs in America now. When you talk about architecture in your reading, you'll see folks talk about a Spanish motif, but actually that was picked up from the Moors. Moors are very dominant in Spain up through the Inquisition. You know, these are the people that introduced cotton manufacture, gunpowder, and other things into Spain. So, you know, again, when we talk about the Europeanization of history, we see some kind of different things in the representation of all of these societies. When I was a little kid, even to this day, one of my favorite movies was the Ten Commandments. I'm not talking about the Disney cartoon Ten Commandments, you know, with kind of colored people looking like Egyptians. I'm talking about the old Cecil B. DeMille epic with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, right? You all are way too young to remember this movie, but they still play it every Easter. And it was one of my favorite movies. I was too young as well. I wasn't around when it was made originally in the 50s, but I certainly watched it as a child, still watch it now. Here's the interesting thing. The Egyptians, an African country, are portrayed largely as whites. Pharaoh Seti, white. Moses is portrayed as by Charlton Heston, white guy. But the Egyptians and the Hebrews here, as Moses is mistaken for an Egyptian prince, though he's actually Hebrew, tells us something about the physical appearance of these people. They probably looked alike. And if they're in Africa, they may have been people of darker hue, yea, even black, if we talk about them being Africans. So that's really interesting. When you talk about the Moors, there was another great movie, Charlton Heston starred in it too, as Prince Rodrigo, called El Cid. And the Moors are cast as these villainous, evil beings who are invading Spain. But even then, they still don't look black as we thought they would. But key points to remember: your Nile Valley civilizations, your Western Sudanic civilizations, and study up on the Moorish influence in Spain as it spread to other places. There are other things to talk about, certainly on the continent, and your teachers will take you through it, but these are highlights for us. The decline of African societies. Why did these great African societies fall as we fast forward and work our way to our homeland of America? And Karenga gives 3, I think, basic observations that are very powerful. 1, all empires fall. 2, it took a long time, about 400 years, for full conquest of the continent. And 3, he says, actually, African societies did not fall. They were conquered, and then Africa was separated by colonization into very different entities. So how did Europe conquer them? He goes through 5 important points that are in your book as well. Always go to your text. I don't want to just regurgitate everything that's in your text because I think that's boring. And your teachers certainly will go through these things as well. But how did Europe conquer Africa? 1, technological advantages. 2, economic advantages over the centuries. 3, slavery, which we'll look at later. 4, internal and external problems. It's not like the Africans were living completely in peace among themselves. And 5, culture. There was no unifying ideology across the vast continent of Africa. So that's very important to remember as well. Let's move on into our next chapter, into this, in chapter 4, as we come to America. And we'll do that with our next video, because it's very important for you to understand that history does not start here in this country. So pay attention to deep reading in your chapter or on continental Africa. Pay attention to the fact that civilizations existed before we get here in chapter 4. And hopefully this is something that'll give you a little bit better foundation to function from. Please remember this. This is an introductory class, all right? So there are a lot of things, whether it's history or politics or religion, that we'll only kind of scratch the surface on because we want to give you a little bit of a taste of it. But then when you get to college, you'll be able to study these things in much more depth in different classes in the Department of Pan-African Studies if you come to the University of Louisville, but certainly in other classes if you have Black Studies departments at the universities where you attend school. So I hope you all are having fun as we've gotten through the first few chapters of this course. Next time, we'll talk about African American history right here in this same space as we work through Introduction to Pan-African Studies. Keep thinking.